Welcome back to the Best PT Podcast. This is episode 3.16, Neurological Rehabilitation Theories and Dogmas. Let's begin by talking about motor control and motor learning. Older theories of motor control believe that the cortex sits at the top of a motor hierarchy and that spinal reflexes are at the very bottom. However, new theories propose that there is a greater distribution of motor control throughout the nervous system. Adams' closed-loop theory believes that current movement is compared with stored information or memory of past movement with an emphasis on practice. Schmidt's schema theory promotes the clinical value of feedback and the importance of practice variation. 3 stages of motor learning. Cognitive is the initial stage of motor learning, characterized by lots of errors, inconsistent performance, with mostly cognitive thinking going on. Associative is the intermediate stage of motor learning. There is a decrease in errors, there is increased coordination and consistency of performance with large amounts of physical practice occurring. And finally, autonomous is the final stage of motor learning. It is characterized as being mostly error-free with automatic responses. Distractions will no longer impact the activity, and the person is now able to begin multitasking activities. Different types of feedback. Intrinsic feedback is what the person perceives through their own sensory system. Extrinsic feedback is provided to the person during or after a task. Current research supports feedback fading or the tapering down of an extrinsic feedback over time. Knowledge of results is terminal feedback about the outcome of a movement. Knowledge of performance is feedback that relates to the actual movement pattern that someone used to achieve a result. Different types of practice. Masked practice is when practice time is greater than rest breaks. Distributed practice is when the rest time is equal or greater to the practice time. Constant practice is the practice of a task in a uniform environment. Variable practice is the practice of a task in a changing environment. Random practice varies practice among different tasks. Blocked practice is the consistent practice of one task. Part training is the practicing of individual components of a greater task, and whole training is the practice of an entire task at once. Moving on to different neurological rehabilitation dogmas now. Carr and Shepard, the motor relearning approach. Targeted normal movement and how it is relearned following neurological injuries. The role of the physical therapist is to identify components of movement that are missing or abnormal and then develop appropriate treatment interventions. Neuromuscular development theory, NDT or BOBATH. Patients learn how to control movement through activities that promote normal movement patterns. Postural control can be learned and modified through experience. Posture uses both feedback and feed-forward mechanisms to execute tasks. Postural control is initiated from the base of support and is required before skill development. Postural control develops by assuming progressive positions that increase the distance between the center of gravity and base of support. There is a large emphasis on the physical therapist facilitating patient movements and a large emphasis on midline control and orientation as well as rotational movements. Brunnstrom movement therapy, a type of movement therapy for hemiplegic patients. It encourages the use and the reinforcement of stroke synergy patterns, which we now know is a bad idea. Lots of research indicates that reinforcing synergy patterns makes them very hard to change later on. Brunnstrom created a 7-stage staging system for recovery following a stroke. Stage 1, there is no volitional movement. Stage 2, the appearance of basic synergies in the beginning of spasticity occurs. Stage 3, patients can voluntarily perform synergies and spasticity increases. Stage 4, spasticity begins to decrease. The patient can perform sub-movement outside of the synergy patterns. Stage 5, spasticity continues to decline and movement begins to become independent of synergy patterns. Stage 6, isolated joint movements can be performed with coordination and without synergy patterns. And finally, Stage 7, normal motor function is said to have been restored. Proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation, or PNF. The theory is that stronger parts of the body can be used to stimulate and strengthen weaker parts. This is a concept called overflow. There is a large emphasis on manual contact, correct handling with short and concise verbal commands. Getting into the diagonal patterns, there is D1 and D2 flexion extension for both the upper and lower extremity. The way I like to remember the upper extremity pattern is that you eat before you fight. So you bring food to your mouth before you draw your sword. D1 flexion, scapular elevation, shoulder adduction, flexion, and external rotation. Elbow flexion or extension, forearm supination, wrist flexion, and thumb adduction. D1 extension, scapular depression, shoulder abduction, extension, and internal rotation with elbow flexion or extension, forearm pronation, wrist extension, and thumb abduction. D2 flexion or the He-Man pose. Scapular elevation, shoulder flexion, abduction, external rotation, elbow flexion or extension, forearm supination, wrist extension, and thumb extension. So imagine holding a sword up over your head. And then D2 extension, imagine yourself drawing a sword from its sheath on your hip. Scapular depression, shoulder extension, adduction, and internal rotation. Elbow flexion or extension, forearm pronation, wrist flexion, and thumb opposition. Lower extremity patterns. D1 flexion, hip flexion, adduction, and external rotation. Knee flexion or extension, ankle dorsiflexion, and inversion. D1 extension, hip extension, abduction, and internal rotation. Knee flexion or extension, ankle plantar flexion, and eversion. D2 flexion, hip flexion, abduction, and internal rotation. Knee flexion or extension, ankle dorsiflexion, and eversion. And then finally, D2 extension, hip extension with adduction, external rotation, knee flexion or extension, plantar flexion, and inversion. Descriptions of the various types of PNF exercises. Rhythmic initiation improves a patient's awareness of a movement and assists in initiating movements and learning new motor patterns. Rhythmic rotation also learns to initiate movements and increases range of motion. Rhythmic stabilization improves strength, endurance, flexibility, co-contraction, muscular ability, stability, and can be used to decrease pain. Slow reversals can improve strength, range of motion, stability, coordination, and endurance. Hold relax exercises can decrease pain, reduce spasms, and improve passive range of motion. Contract relax can increase passive range of motion in the absence of pain and promote relaxation. Combination of isotonics, so concentric and eccentric exercises together, can be used to improve strength and range of motion. And finally, quick stretch exercises can increase the speed of a movement and assist with initiating voluntary movement. The last theory is the Rude theory of sensory motor learning. Treatment emphasizes obtaining homeostasis with motor output. The purpose is to activate muscles to perform a task independent of a stimulus, and believe that exercise is only effective if the correct response is produced. There is an emphasis on joint approximation and compression, the use of tapping, and the use of modalities such as ice or heat to elicit motor performance. That's it for episode 3.16, talking about neuromuscular rehabilitation theories and dogmas. The next episode is 3.17, pediatric development. As always, the outline will be in the show notes. Thanks for joining me.